Effie went on to describe the strange events which followed Brutus's defeat. Apparently, a man began coming to the kennel to see Brutus and brought with him a new handler who worked with Brutus every day. For months this went on, until one day Brutus was taken away to the city.
I assume it was for some big fight, but no one really knows for sure,
said Effie.
The trips became more regular as time went on, but the reason for the trips was a constant mystery. From what I hear, Brutus gets very violent if any of the other dogs mention his trips, so no one asks anymore. I guess it doesn't matter much now, with him being so close to death and all.
Of course, one might imagine the effect these words had upon my friend. Near death, you say? Sir Happy could hardly contain his enthusiasm. I'm all ears, dear Effie. Please, go on.
Apparently,
she said in a more conspiratorial tone,
he received a nasty wound during his last fight, and it won't heal. He's been whimpering for days, and I've heard whispers his throat is nearly swollen shut. He'll take no water or food because of the pain. He must be very weak by now, because I can no longer hear his whines.
By this time, Sir Happy was very agitated and asked with some force, Where is he now?
If they haven't moved him, he should be at the other end of the kennel in a cage off by itself,
Effie said. I shall return momentarily, Sir Happy said with great animation, and was off in the direction of the injured canine, barking a command for Hiram to follow. It appears as though Sir Happy has found something of interest, your lordship, and is requesting we follow along, said Hiram to his unhappy captive. I'll not be ordered around by some witless animal, was the man's reply. Hiram got behind Lord Pierrepont and gave him a nudge in the direction Sir Happy had run. You'll bloody well follow him until I say otherwise. It did not take long for Sir Happy to find the cage in question, for it was the only one not stacked upon or beneath another. Lying quite motionless in the bottom of it was a dog of impressive proportions, with a massive head and chest. He was certainly powerful enough to take down a full-grown man, and the color of the dog's coat matched several of the descriptions given of the elusive canine attacker. Had Sir Happy had any doubts about the identity of the canine based on size and description, they were removed by the confirmation received by his own sensitive nose. There was no mistaking it. The scent of this injured creature was an exact match to the scent Sir Happy had detected at the McGibbons murder scene and upon his own precious owner, Stephen, when we found him lying in a pool of his own blood. Hiram, Sir Happy barked, I have found him. Come, quickly. This does not bode well for you, Lord Pierrepont, said Hiram to his unwilling captive as they reached the front of the cage. Pierrepont's face blanched the moment he saw the incapacitated dog. He attempted to gain control over his reaction, fearful he might give away more than he intended. I cannot see why I should be concerned over a sick animal or over your dog's response to it, he stammered, trying to appear unconcerned about the discovery. Hiram responded very confidently. Sir Happy has identified this creature as the fiend responsible for the attacks in London, which means, sir, you are now culpable in these cases, much as I believed you would be when I first arrived. This is absurd, Lord Pierrepont exclaimed. He could be barking for any number of reasons. You're looking for any excuse to place blame on me, and I do not believe it matters to you if your so-called evidence is fabricated or not. Hiram seemed a little ruffled by the accusation, and he very quickly replied, I needn't fabricate evidence. Your guilt clings to you like a foul stench. Besides, If Sir Happy says this dog is the one we have been hunting, then I know we have found our villain, at least the canine one. He is merely a dumb animal barking like the rest of these mutts for his own amusement, Lord Pierrepont shot back. Hiram retorted, this coming from a man who methodically murders his own animals. I certainly wouldn't throw your petty insults at Sir Happy. I would trust his innate intelligence over your own any day. While the two men exchanged barbs with one another, Sir Happy found himself overcome with a rush of emotions. He was elated to have found the villainous assailant, bringing a portion of the case to a close. But there was a part of him, the emotional part, that wanted vengeance for the attack on his beloved Stephen. This creature had attempted to rip away the one person who meant everything to Sir Happy, the person who was the center of his world. Even now he felt sick to his stomach, envisioning his dear Stephen lying motionless in the street, barely holding on to life. What he would have given as he stood watching his master's life slipping away to have had the fiend in his clutches and been capable of inflicting a pain upon the creature's person equal to the agony which had wrenched through his own heart. Now Sir Happy had his chance. The beast was within easy reach, just a minor manipulation of the cage door, and Sir Happy would be upon him. How effortless it would be to close his own powerful jaws over Brutus's unprotected throat and bite down until all breath was crushed from his windpipe. It would be over in a moment. Justice would be served. Stephen would be avenged, and no one would believe Sir Happy's actions were brought about by a desire for revenge. Visions of Stephen's broken, bloody body rose like evil specters, threatening to destroy what little self-control my poor friend had left. It would be so easy to mete out this corrupted version of justice. It was a delicious idea at first glance, but as Sir Happy stood there looking upon the body of this vile creature, he could not help but feel tainted by his own thoughts. Can murder ever be justified? He knew the answer before he even asked the question, and yet his mind still dwelt upon the temptation before him. There was a moment during this internal struggle when the beast opened his eyes and met Sir Happy's gaze. Even through the agony of his injuries, the creature dripped malice like a viper's poisoned fang. Although Sir Happy despised this creature above any other he had ever known, he could not surrender himself to the kind of vengeance which was so easily at hand. The two enemies glared at each other for some time, each one despising the other for entirely different reasons. It was Sir Happy who finally broke the malignant silence between them. I am not like you, Brutus, he said to the injured dog, and I will not allow my hatred for you to transform me into some corrupted image of you. You have committed your sins, and you shall pay the consequences for them. Vengeance may not be mine to give, but true justice I shall willingly deliver. Brutus was unable to respond, but the malevolent look he gave my friend was enough to let Sir Happy know the message was heard, if not completely understood. Hiram noticed the tension between the two dogs and heard the low, rumbling growls coming from Sir Happy. Recognizing his friend was most probably facing the same creature which had attacked Stephen, Hiram thought it best to bring the attention back to the case at hand. Easy there, Sir Happy. He's not going anywhere, and we have very important business to attend to. We shall bring Charles back here soon enough to verify this creature's identity. In the meantime, we have other investigative work to do. At first, Hiram thought it would be impossible to tear Sir Happy away from the cage, given the circumstances, but there was one thing Hiram was unaware of at the time. My friend, Sir Happy,
has the innate ability to apply liberal dollops of common sense and practically to almost and practicality to almost any situation, which has been his salvation at times when emotion might have overcome him. Sir Happy knew his identification of the canine as being responsible for the attacks was not enough confirmation for the courts, nor would it be enough to tie the dog to any one person in the Pierrepont household. Other corroborating evidence had to be collected and compared to existing data to determine with all certainty whether Brutus was the mysterious mauler. Also, there was a human element associated with the attacks, and the murderer, which must be identified. Brutus had not acted alone or upon his own will. Horace's testimony confirmed it. However, since a pigeon's testimony could not be entered into evidence, more substantial proof would need to be found, and there were questions which needed answering. It was time to return to the manor. Chapter 21. As the listener might recall, Charles and I, having been left behind by our two carriage-stealing friends, accompanied Magistrate Peavy into the grand hall of the manor with the goal of meeting the younger Lord Pierrepont. As we once again passed through the massive main entrance into what was more a magnificent gallery than a vestibule, I found myself overwhelmed by the grandeur and luxury of the manor's interior. Although I shall not suffer my listeners to wade through every detail of the imported damasks, the velvet pillows, the handcrafted woodworking, or the vast collection of marble statues, suffice it to say, no expense had been spared to furnish and decorate the inside of this lavish home. It was almost vulgar in its ostentation, and not entirely what I would have expected from a gentleman of Lord Pierrepont's standing and lineage. It was the type of overdone decor one would expect from a man who had only recently gained wealth to afford such fineries, but had not the refinement to know when to stop. Upon entering the gallery, we were immediately directed to the library, where the younger lord of the manor was waiting for us. Whatever I had expected to find in the person of Devlin Pierrepont, I can assure you it was completely contrary to what I found. Imagine my surprise at discovering the young man, whom I had banked so much of my suspicions on, was confined to a wheelchair. Apparently, I was not the only one taken aback by the young man's physical condition, because I distinctly heard Charles utter a muffled, "Good heavens!" upon entering the room. Lord Devlin was polite enough during the introductions, and even went so far as to pat me gently upon the head, a very natural-seeming response which raised the young man a good bit higher in my esteem than Peavy and Lestrand combined. Lord Devlin was a well-formed young man of nearly 20 years, with coal-black hair and piercing dark eyes. He might even have been called handsome, were it not for the fact he maintained a peculiar twist to his mouth, which gave one the overall impression he was perpetually sucking on something sour. Were it not for the wheelchair to which he was confined, I might have guessed him to be as healthy as any other young man of his age. Lord Devlin and Charles went through the conventional pleasantries regarding the weather, our journey through the country, and other such subject matter usually touched upon in polite conversation. Since I knew my direct participation in the exchange was unnecessary, and considering the inconsequential nature of the subject matter itself, I took it upon myself to become more intimately acquainted with our current surroundings. Or should I say more accurately, I spent a considerable amount of time browsing through the various titles and subjects that made up the vast collection of books within the library. There were thousands of volumes of works, perhaps even tens of thousands. While I am certain Sir Happy would have used the opportunity I was granted in more constructive manner by cataloging every detail of the room and its occupants, walls, I found myself completely overwhelmed by the seemingly limitless content before me. It was like a tapestry of the imagination, made not from yarn and thread, but woven together from the thoughts and ideas of the human intellect and artfully displayed within the pages of each volume. Each work was a masterpiece, woven on the loom of the creator's mind. The images each word inspired was colored by the rich tones of creativity, framed by the deep love each author had for his subject. History, literature, art, romance, every written work was a window into the heart of the master who crafted it. Lost as I was to the astounding collection of books before me, I did attempt in some respects to observe some basic details about the room itself. The library was a room of remarkable proportions. As I made my way through the vast collection of works, I noted at least 3 walls had been removed to accommodate the expansion of the collection. From what I could tell, almost the entire western wing of the mansion had been consumed in the process, including both the upper and lower levels. Although the construction efforts had been eloquently executed, I could still detect subtle changes in the layout of the immense room which resulted from the expansion. In one corner, I could see where the front parlor had been. Over in another corner, I could perceive where a sizable study had existed. The farthest section of the room had once been an expansive kitchen or food preparation area, which still smelled a bit like poultry and onions, with a dash of pork thrown in for good measure. It was obvious the servants of the house had gone to great lengths to scrub away the traces of these unmistakable odors, but I could detect them nonetheless. Being a cat with a relatively keen sense of smell, the servants' efforts had been inadequate, and it took me very little time to determine the family's favorite dishes. The area in front of the old kitchen had once been an elegant dining room, capable of accommodating at least 30 or so people. The crystal chandeliers which hung there now had illuminated many an evening dinner party, still hung in their places of honor, a testimony of sorts to the area's previous identity. As I strolled through the lower section of the library, cataloging the contents of the shelves, it appeared as though every nook and cranny in this seemingly endless space was crowded with books, manuscripts, and assortments of other printed works which spanned the centuries. What I did find lacking in the library was any kind of personal items that would have been a testimony to the family's collective history. There were no antiques, no souvenirs from distant travels, no painted likenesses, no family heirlooms, just printed works. Not that I minded such a singular focus in a room. It struck me as odd and contrary to most people's habits. I did my best to absorb as many sights and smells associated with each section as my distracted brain would allow, knowing at some point in the day I would be required to give an account of all I had seen to Sir Happy when he returned. As though I made my mental catalogue of the library and its contents, I began to notice several large decorative wooden panels spaced around the room at odd intervals in various sections. Each panel was itself a work of art, having been meticulously carved by a master craftsman, and each one seemed to have a story to tell. The first one I came across was a scene of the hunt, with riders on horseback and their faithful hounds chasing a magnificent elk through the forest. Another panel depicted a family picnic, with children laughing and playing in a wide open glade with little pups nipping at their heels. Still another portrayed a battle in the Roman Colosseum between a lion and a pack of dogs. In fact, every panel I examined had a depiction of a dog of one kind or another. Some even had groups of dogs interacting with their masters or carrying out some unspoken command. I still believe the addition of a feline figure in some of the reliefs would have added a touch of nobility to the craftsmanship, but even without it, the carvings were remarkable.
I cannot say with certainty how long I spent in my exploration. I can only testify I was so lost in my complete admiration of my surroundings, I hardly noticed when Hiram and Sir Happy returned. It was only after Sir Happy came up next to me and stood for some time staring at me with his most penetrating gaze that I reluctantly tore myself away from my ruminations. Considering the ordeal he had just been through, he seemed fairly light-hearted as he said, I hate to disturb you, old chap, but we have quite a bit of work to do before we take our leisure to read. His voice was filled with mirth, and could not help but chuckle at how it must have looked, me staring up at the shelves as though I was trying to find the title which intrigued me the most. After all, such was my inclination when time permitted me to enjoy a good book. There were times, in fact, when I spent more time in indecision than I did in the actual pages of the book I finally selected. I cleared my throat before saying, I will have you know, I was in the process of intense investigation when you interrupted me just now. My friend gave me a look of deepest skepticism. I am in earnest, I continued. I've been cataloging the contents and layout of the library, and I think you will find it most interesting. I was eager to share my findings with my friend now that I was back in a more investigative frame of mind. In an effort to redeem myself, I told him everything I had noted regarding the room. I walked him through each phase of my exploration of the library, from the transformation of the various rooms to the content on the shelves. I walked my friend through every step I took from the moment Charles and I entered the room to the moment Hiram and Sir Happy returned. Very nicely done, Mommy, Sir Happy said finally. You have taken a very methodical route, and I applaud you for it. Now, have you found anything substantive relating to the case? I had to admit I had not. I could only comment the collection of books was extraordinarily large, and its diversity beyond anything I'd ever seen or heard of. I was very quick to mention the incorporation of the kitchen as being particularly peculiar, to which my friend replied, Yes, Mommy, it is very peculiar, but of little consequence to us now. Whatever crime happened here, its occurrence was long ago, well before the current residents took control of the manor. I can hardly express the confusion and shock I felt at such a revelation. A murder in the kitchen. We had only just begun to make progress in our own murder investigation, and now Sir Happy was announcing the evidence of another, though it was, in his terms, completely unrelated to our current inquiry. It was nevertheless a murder, and one I had apparently overlooked in my meandering. Sir Happy, ever the perceptive detective, answered my unspoken shock and disappointment in myself by saying, Do not castigate yourself, Mommy. You have a very keen sense, and would very quickly have identified the kitchen area as being the scene of a vicious and extremely untidy crime, had you the luxury of time to conduct a more thorough examination of the area. Remember, my friend, you have had the rather daunting task of cataloguing as much as you could in this place. I only discovered the secret of the room because you had done the rest of the work for me. His praises did much to lighten my feelings of self-doubt, but I had to ask what felt like the most obvious question. How did you know? About the murder, I mean. What did I overlook? Sir Happy glanced back in the direction where the kitchen had been, taking note of the crystal chandeliers and the stucco brick wall that had once been part of the cooking hearth. My guess is the demolition of the kitchen was the primary means of covering up the crime, and it would not surprise me in the least to discover the struggle began in the dining room. Perhaps there's even blood evidence on these old, oddly placed chandeliers. You know blood spatter is the hardest to clean up. It gets all over everything. My curiosity was burning to discover further details behind what my friend had just revealed, but try as I might to find some uh-oh. Uh-oh. But try as I might to find some justification for relating this old murder to the one we were currently investigating, I could find no plausible connection to warrant a shift in our focus. I was, however, reminded about my friend's earlier disappearance with Hiram and the carriage as they chased after the mysterious rider, and so I asked him for an account of his adventure. Sir Happy very quickly ran through the particulars of their adventure, which I have already shared with my listeners regarding my friend's merry chase of horse and carriage, with further details of the kennel conditions too horrifying to repeat. I did, however, have my suspicions there was more to his encounter with the dog he called Brutus than he was willing to share, but knowing he had faced the very creature that nearly murdered his beloved Stephen, I was determined not to push the subject any further. Instead, I asked him to identify the gentleman who was standing next to Hiram. Sir Happy bristled at the sight of the man and very quickly answered, "Make no mistake, Marmee, he is no gentleman, aside from being one of the most despicable creatures to ever walk the earth. He claims to be Lord Jeremy Pierrepont, the owner and master of this estate." I took a second, closer look at the man. I saw beneath the muck and filth which covered him a general similarity between this Lord Pierrepont and young Devlin. The greatest difference at this moment was the fact the elder man had a look of indignant rage upon his face, while Devlin displayed not the slightest concern for the situation. One might have believed the young man was entertaining welcome guests rather than being the focus of an inquest. As I studied the person of Lord Jeremy Pierrepont, I became suddenly aware of the most dreadful stench coming from the direction of Sir Happy. I realized he, too, was covered in the same muck-splattering the clothing of Lord Jeremy. As a matter of fact, Hiram was besmeared as well. Looking back to Sir Happy, I noted there were parts of him which had been partially buried in the putrid substance. I could not help but take a closer sniff, attempting to put aside for a moment how truly offensive the smell was. "What on earth do you have splattered all over your coat?" I blurted out. "It is positively dreadful. I cannot believe I did not notice it before. It is bad enough to spoil any thought of supper." Sir Happy looked himself over. "This," he said, nodding with his head, "is the muck that comes from years of neglecting animals and allowing them to live and die in rivers of their own filth. If I were a man, Marmee—" He paused as he looked over at Lord Jeremy. The look of disgust and outright animosity on his face was something I would never forget. He looked back at me. "I cannot say what I would do, but I can promise you it would not be pleasant." "I have no doubts, my friend," was all I could say. I did, however, recommend he do his best to scrape the grime from his coat. "You will not be able to detect anything beyond your own stink if you do not, and we need your sense of smell to be at its best if we expect to find any evidence against this household." The practical side of Sir Happy took over, displacing for a time any indignation he might have felt, and he acknowledged the wisdom in what I said. "I had almost forgotten I was a stinking mess. It is never a good thing when one cannot smell oneself." He trotted behind one of the many couches in the library, and, to my complete surprise and horror, began rolling around on it like some kind of deranged lunatic, his feet kicking in the air and his head swerving from side to side. Within a few minutes, he was in much better shape,
while the rug, let us just say when he was done with his activity, it no longer had the same appeal it once had. You smell a bit better, I said, although I could still detect a lingering stench.
I feel much better, he replied.
We might consider moving on to another location before we are found out, I suggested. I would hate to be associated with the current state of the poor Persian carpet. I do not believe its owner would be pleased at its condition. Sir Happy snorted at the thought, as though he cared little for raising the ire of Lord Jeremy. But he did agree we had other work to do, and so we moved in the direction of our two friends, Hiram and Charles. I must admit, with every step we took away from the contaminated rug, I felt an even greater sense of relief. My fastidious nature made it very hard for me to accept what he had just done, but considering for a moment what I would have done were I in the same situation, I cannot say I would have behaved any differently. There are some things grooming in the normal way. There are some things grooming in the normal way won't remove. I also thought about our return home, and felt quite certain Amelia would insist on a bath before Sir Happy would be allowed to sit on any of the furniture. I felt a sudden tinge of fear she would make me take one as well, just for good measure. As we approached the others, I noticed Lord Jeremy's face was an unhealthy shade of red, and he was struggling, albeit futilely, against Hiram's hold. Right at the moment we joined the rest of our party, Lord Jeremy burst out with,
"Unhand me!"
The look Hiram had on his face was much like the one a parent gets when they carry a fussy child to bed, especially when the child does not wish to go. No matter how hard Lord Pierrepont thrashed about, he could not dislodge himself from the grasp of our friend. Lord Pierrepont's protests began to escalate. His language became more abusive and his threats of harm more pronounced. I shall not repeat, even in the telling, the colorful epithets which resulted from his tirade, but the sentiment behind them would have made the crustiest sea crab blush and wash his own mouth out for shame. At one point, Lord Devlin very calmly rebuked his father by saying, "Father, please, try and be reasonable. The inspector's just trying to do his job." Everyone was startled by the young man's statement, but none more so than the father himself. A look of shock and even a hint of dismay replaced, for a moment, the look of rage upon the Lord Pierrepont's face.
"How dare you speak to me so, boy?" shouted Lord Jeremy. "You who sent me on that devil's errand when these men first arrived."
Devlin's demeanor did not change as he calmly replied, "Do not blame your actions upon me, father. I sent you on no errand. I merely stated that with the arrival of these men came the downfall of your greatest passion, your precious dog fights. You were the one, under the guidance of Magistrate Peavy and his creepy henchman Lestrand, who went galloping off to deal with your dirty little secrets." I thought for a moment Magistrate Peavy was going to expire before our very eyes as the truth of the initial delay came out. In the one brief statement, it became apparent why Peavy had been so adamant to usher us all into the manor house after making us wait so long. The magistrate's face turned a brilliant shade of red. He clutched his chest and plopped down in the seat behind him. All Peavy could say was, I... Whatever excuse the magistrate might have concocted was gone before he could use it. Lestrand said nothing but turned very ashen and looked as though he was going to be sick upon the rug in front of him. Hiram's face became like stone as he glared at the two men.
"I see," he said very coldly. "We will deal with the two of you later. I recommend you both stay on the premises for the rest of the time we are here. I would hate to have to hunt either one of you down, although I would do so without hesitation. Hiram moved in closer to Peavy as he said, "You had better start praying now, magistrate. There's nothing more sinister to connect you with than covering up an illegal dog-fighting ring." Peavy gulped, but said nothing more. Lord Pierrepont was incensed by what his son had revealed. Lord Devlin sat in his chair extremely pleased with himself. The comments seemed innocent enough, but had in fact been a calculated blow meant to implicate and humiliate the parties involved, especially his father. Lord Pierrepont's sense of outrage finally boiled over, and he lunged for the young man's wheelchair. Thankfully, Hiram is as fast as he is strong. He managed to tackle the elder Pierrepont before he could reach his goal. "Easy now," Hiram yelled as he regained control of the other man. "There will be none of that." Lord Pierrepont heard none of it. He just glared at his son. "Why do you look so surprised, father?" Lord Devlin asked, once he was certain Hiram had his father under control. "Do you really think I'm going to protect you now, after all these years of being ignored and rejected by you? Those dogs of yours have been your only passion since mother died. I care little what happens to either you or your mongrels. As you are so fond of saying to me when I've fallen out of my chair, you have brought this upon yourself. Now deal with it." "Why, you—" The father again lunged for his son, with a look of malice that made my fur stand on end. There was deadly intent in Lord Pierrepont's taut body, and it was barely controlled by Hiram's greater strength. Had Hiram not been there to intercede, I felt certain we would have had another murder on our hands. Seeing the terrible look in Lord Pierrepont's eyes, I could believe him capable of anything. To think this young man had lived his entire life with such a creature was more than my heart could bear. Such constant conflict and malice could sour any apple, even a good one. And so it came as no great surprise to me that young Devlin's expression had become so twisted and deformed. I felt pity for the boy who is not really a boy. I believe everyone began to feel a sense of pity for Devlin, everyone but Sir Happy. I could see a look of suspicion go across his face, as if he sensed there was more to the exchange between father and son than the rest of us perceived. Knowing what little I did at the time of Sir Happy's experience at the kennel, I suspected Sir Happy viewed Devlin in the same awful light as his father, as though the familial connection somehow contaminated the young man. The sins of the father were falling upon the shoulders of his son in the eyes of my friend, and for just a moment I frowned upon his judgment. Why blame Devlin for what his father had done? After all, there seemed to be no love lost between the two. In my mind, it was highly probable Devlin had, having faced such abuse in his childhood, elected in his later years to behave in a manner which was contrary to what his father had become. Even so, I could not fault Sir Happy for what he might feel, considering what he had witnessed only a short while ago, so I said nothing to him about his mistrust. Hiram, in the meantime, had decided his next course of action and took advantage of the momentary lull to announce his plans to the rest of the group. "Now that we have had this glorious opportunity to learn so many interesting things about each other," he began, giving Peavy and Lestrade a very significant, and I might add menacing, glare, "we shall continue in our pursuit of truth by having a look at the room where Dr. Stephen Hanover took his leisure when he was here." "Excuse me?" asked Lord Pierrepont. As if speaking to a child that could not comprehend, Hiram repeated his desire in more simplistic terms. "I want to see the room where Dr. Stephen Hanover slept while he was here." Lord Pierrepont was perturbed by Hiram's condescension. I know what you mean, Lord Pierrepont snapped. I simply fail to see the relevance of searching his temporary sleeping quarters. What do you hope to gain from such a random exercise? Lord Jeremy, obviously disconcerted, tried to maintain a facade of complete calm. Considering his earlier deportment with his son and his unending hostility toward the rest of us, his sudden attempt at composure seemed a bit overdone. Hiram simply glared at the great lord, saying nothing in reply. I see you are resolute, then, Lord Pierrepont said through the lump in his throat. So there's no point in trying to hinder your efforts. Go where you like. I have nothing to hide. Hiram smiled. Well then, since there are no objections, we shall all go together, he said, giving Peavy and Lestrade a significant look as he spoke. Everyone looked at Devlin and his wheelchair. Please do not concern yourself about me, Devlin said. I shall meet you on the 3rd floor. Humphreys, he said, turning to a gentleman's servant who had taken his place behind the young man. Would you be so kind as to assist me with the lift? I'm not feeling well today. All of this activity has sapped my strength. Turning his attentions back towards Hiram and Charles, Devlin explained, I have a mechanical lift that takes me to the various levels of the house. It helps compensate for my inability to use the stairs. I would invite you all to join me. However, the lift is only large enough to accommodate my chair and perhaps 2 other people. Humphreys must help me with my chair, but perhaps Mr. Hurst, if you are game, you might join us and bring your 4-legged friends. I fear the rest of you will have to settle for the stairs. I am sure, Father, you can show them the way. Devlin smiled at his father, but there was no mirth behind his eyes. Their mutual disdain was evident to us all. I must admit I was intrigued by the idea of a mechanical lift, and it was with great anticipation that I contemplated the idea of moving from one level of the manor to another without really moving. Sir Happy, on the other hand, showed no interest in accepting Devlin's offer. You go, Mommy, Sir Happy said, and keep an eye on the young man. I will follow Hiram and the others up the stairs. I do not trust either of these Pierreponts, but I trust the father even less than the son. Keep your wits about you, though. There are many secrets to be uncovered in this house. I would bet my life on it. Sir Happy went trotting off in the direction of the stairs, and I was left to follow behind the young man and his chair. I must say my experience in the lift was more unnerving than it was exhilarating. I felt more than once, as we jolted our way to the 3rd floor, as though I was going to be sick. It was an unnatural sensation, being elevated from one level of the house to the next. Although it was an impressive feat of engineering, I could not see such an invention as a mechanical lift ever being used in the public sector. In my opinion, stairs would forever be the preferred means of going from one floor to the next.